A few weeks ago, I released a video called Dropsite Massacre Rewrote Primarch Powerscaling. A lot of people loved it, a good portion argued about it, and a few even tried to sick Lehman Russ on me in the comments. Some viewers insisted that it's impossible to powerscale the Primarchs, the lore is too inconsistent, their feats don't line up, and Mortarion himself said it at the Ulanor Triumph, they were all made for different battles. And honestly, I won't say they're wrong. But hear me out, there is a way to powerscale the Primarchs, which is exactly why I made this video. Warhammer 40K is a land of contradictions and inconsistencies. A Space Marine kills a Catan shard in one book and can't beat a toaster in another. And the Primarchs, they are the peak of inconsistencies. Their power fluctuates based on plot armor, vibes, or however much ketamine Black Library authors are running on that day. So in today's video, I have one simple mission to explain to you all in autistic detail how you can actually powerscale the Primarchs. We'll cover what powerscaling even is, how it can be applied to the Primarchs using 3 different examples, to show multiple variations and situations, the flaws and limitations of powerscaling, and finally, why Primarch powerscaling is so goddamn difficult. So yes, the big old stink daddy Mortarion said you can't powerscale the Primarchs. But in today's episode of Powerscaling Peeps, I'm going to show you that you can, you just have to do it the right way. Join me in the cow hole, fellas. We all drink milk down here. Say it with me. It's time to powerscale. So let's start by explaining what powerscaling actually is. At its core, powerscaling is the process of assessing a character's strength or battle power, kind of like looking at a power level, so to say. But the key difference is, instead of just asking, how strong is this character, powerscaling asks, how strong is this character compared to others? It's all about comparison, context, and consistency. The 3 C's, especially when the characters in question have never directly fought each other. And of course, this is one of my favorite things to do on this channel. Unless you've been living under a rock. I mean, come on guys, it's part of my catchphrase you literally just heard. It's time to powerscale. Essentially, you take a character, examine their core attributes like strength, speed, durability, psychic ability, adaptability, skill, and list all of their best feats across the lore. Then you compare all of those stats and feats against other characters using the same exact method. That's how you logically determine who is stronger. It's like building a case based on what they've actually done and what they could theoretically do. For example, let's compare Sanguinius and the Silent King. You would start with Sanguinius, factor in his Primarch physiology, insane speed, flight, precognition, combat skill, and durability. Then you would look at his feats. Fighting greater demons like Kabanda and Chris, defeating the demon Primarch Angron, and holding his own, albeit briefly, against Horus at the height of his corruption and power. What makes these feats even more impressive is the context to them. Sanguinius often accomplished them while exhausted, wounded, or just overall drained. Context is crucial. What's going on with the character at the time of the fight? Are they injured, tired? Do they have a powerful artifact that amplifies their abilities? Looking at you, Lehman Russ. To put it quite simply, understanding context is one of the most important aspects of powerscaling in general. After assessing Sanguinius, you would do the same for the Silent King. Examine his durability, strength, and speed, as well as his abilities, weapons, and control over Necron reality warping technology. Finally, you would compare the two. Sanguinius, the magnificent Hawkboy, versus the Silent King, the big bone daddy. Then you would place one over the other based on who has the better feats, weapons, and overall abilities. Which of course is obviously the Silent King. I mean, the dude has a scepter that one-shot a Warlord Titan. Yes fellas, that's right, he one-shot a Warlord Titan. Yeah, the Silent King is simply broken. And that is the essence of powerscaling. It's about guessing who would win in a fistfight. It's about analyzing feats, context, and consistency, or FCC, to build a logical conclusion. It's not perfect, but when used properly, it works. Now that we've gone over what power scaling is, let's go through a couple of examples to see how it actually works in practice and how we can use it to rank Primarchs against each other. Let's start with an easy one, folks. Corvus Corax vs Lorgar in the book First Heretic. During the Dropsite Massacre, the Raven Lord and the Bringer of the Word go head to head. Corvus Corax achieves a decisive victory after a prolonged duel, with both of his talons impaling Lorgar, leaving him at Corax's mercy. Now, some people like to argue that Lorgar had no chance, but the fight was actually a little closer than it seems. Even so, Lorgar ultimately loses and would have likely died if not for Conrad Kerr's intervention. From this fight, we can make several conclusions. First, Lorgar is naturally weaker than Corvus Corax. 2, because Corax himself states that he would have lost to Angron in the book Raven's Flight near the end of the Dropsite Massacre, we can logically deduce that Lorgar is also weaker than Angron. And 3, if we dive further than that, Post-Davin Horus, which is Horus after being corrupted and amped by the powers of chaos on the world of Davin, defeats Angron in the book Ashes of the Imperium, which means that Angron, Corax, and Lorgar all fall below Horus's power at this point in the timeline. And if you had to rank them from strongest to weakest, it would be Horus in his post-Davin form, Angron, then Corvus Corax, and then Lorgar. This is a pretty clean, clear-cut example of how power scaling works in regards to the Primarchs. By looking at feats, outcomes, and context, even if the characters never fight directly, you can logically rank their relative strength. Let's make things a little bit harder, shall we? The next example is a combination of context and logical thinking. In the book Pharos, Sanguinius and Conrad Kerrs fight briefly and effectively draw against each other. Due to them both possessing Foresight, they could see exactly where the other was going to attack, making neither able to land a decisive blow. So what does this mean? Are Kerrs and Sanguinius equal to each other? What a shocking revelation. Well, not exactly. There's some important context to this fight we have to factor in here. While Sanguinius and Kerrs draw in combat, Kerrs is fully equipped, wearing complete power armor and wielding his lethal lightning claws, while Sanguinius is literally in a bathrobe using an ornate silver blade. Not in carmine or the spear of Telesto. Now, power armor is a huge advantage for Kerrs. Primarch power armor significantly increases their abilities. Primarchs are already immensely powerful, so their armor focuses more on augmenting their existing superhuman traits, providing immense protection and allowing nimble movement despite being incredibly heavy. Each suit of Primarch armor typically enhances their abilities to some degree. For example, the Khan's armor enhanced his speed and reflexes. While Kerrs' armor doesn't have a specific stated unique ability, it can be assumed that it enhances his overall protection, speed, agility, and striking power. The same goes for his weapons. Mercy and Forgiveness, mastercrafted Artificer Lightning Claws, that are lethal even without a power field, and when activated, they can penetrate almost any material in the universe. Meanwhile, Sanguinius is using nothing but a ceremonial sword and wearing pretty much bathrobes, and yet he still draws with Kerrs. So, what can we gather from this in terms of power scaling? If Sanguinius was able to draw with Kerrs while wearing minimal armor and wielding only an ornate sword, which is far weaker than his normal weapons, it stands to reason that with full power armor and his primary weapons at his disposal, Sanguinius would come out on top. This is a concise example of how context can drastically change outcomes. By accounting for differences in equipment, buffs, or nerfs, we can realistically determine which Primarch would hold the natural advantage in a given scenario. It demonstrates how power scaling allows us to factor in variations and draw logical conclusions about relative strength. I mean, we can go even further. To support my argument, I could also use the evidence of Rabute Gilliman almost being killed by an Alpha Legion surprise attack when he was completely out of armor. It stands to reason that if he was fully equipped in power armor and his gear, he would have easily blitzed this squad and destroyed them. But similar to Sanguinius, he was also in a bathrobe, which almost resulted in him being killed. Next, for our third example, we're gonna get real autistic here, with a very hard example. All the Primarch fights with base and demon Primarch Angron. This example may take a second to explain, so hold on to your butts, people. A quick note before continuing, when I say base, I mean a Primarch in their default state. No warp buffs, mutations, or weapon upgrades. For example, the Lion in 30k is base, while the 40k Knight of Nihilus Lion, who has warp enhanced abilities like Forest Walk and enhanced power with the Emperor's Shield. This distinction matters when scaling Primarchs, because base Angron and demon Primarch Angron are not the same. Base and demon Primarch Angron have 5 notable fights. First, Leman Russ in the Book Betrayer. Second, Gilliman in the Book Betrayer as well. Third, Sanguinius in Echoes of Eternity. Fourth, Lionel Johnson in Ark of Omens. And fifth, Perturabo in Slaves to Darkness. For this example, I'm going to go through each fight and power scale each Primarch based on the context, the feats, powers, and abilities presented in them, and finally, a clear and concise power ranking of each of the Primarchs who fought Angron and Demon Primarch Angron throughout 40k. Let's start with Angron vs Leman Russ, one of the most controversial duels because it happens almost completely off screen. I'm going to try to be as fair as possible here, which means I'm going to be autistic as hell with the details. This duel happens right after Angron and the World Eaters have annihilated a planet and are bloodied and wounded while the Space Wolves are arriving fresh. The text even spells this out. Angron awash with blood and carved up by fresh wounds, Leman Russ in resplendent plate, the colors of the storm, on his Tempest homeworld. So Angron is already wounded before the duel begins. We don't know how severe the wounds are, but because the text doesn't reference them again, we can reasonably assume they aren't too impactful, but he is definitely not 100% unlike Russ. The two argue about the butcher's nails, and outside of power scaling, I'll say it, Leman Russ actually brings up a pretty valid argument, and Angron is too stupid and too furious to care. The two stare each other down like a true Mexican standoff, and then someone fires the first shot. Nobody knows who, and both legions attack each other. Russ and Angron begin to duel, and we actually get Angron's own recounting of how the duel ended. "You're wrong," Angron snarls, his voice weighed down by emotion rather than anger. "You're wrong. It wasn't in the rain. It was at sunset on a day already darkened by the burning city behind us. My blade broke, but it didn't matter. I pulled his chainsword from his fist and broke it in my hands. We fell into the mud, brawling. We'd both known that fight would end up on the ground. I had him, Lorgar, my boot on his throat, at the very end. I stood above him at last, and Russ had to crawl away, fang teeth clenched, breathing spit as much as breath. Strings of it tumbled from his cracked lips. Angron chased as the Wolf King staggered to his feet, but Russ opened his arms wide, offering no fight. Then it's revealed that the Space Wolves have surrounded Angron and are ready to gun him down, and that ends the duel. A lot of fans claim Russ planned this or that he had set Angron up to prove a point, but the text does not support this interpretation. They came in ragged packs, abandoning the warfare to form a ring around their Primarch. Wolf after wolf, close enough for Angron to make out the individual totems and talismans, rattling against their storm gray armor, moving to stand in ragged ranks with their brothers. So from all of this, we can gather that Russ lost the duel straight up. Seeing their Primarch losing, the Space Wolves broke from the battle to save Leman Russ. The World Eaters did not, because of the Butcher's Nails consuming their brain, resulting in them not caring for their Primarch at all, and only battle. And yes, Russ could have ordered Angron executed on the spot, but that doesn't change the outcome of the one-on-one fight. And please, don't bring up that argument that Leman Russ with intent would have beaten Angron. What does that even mean? I've seen that so much recently, it's gotta be a very, very goofball thing to say. Leman Russ has fought with full murderous intent before against the Lion over a simple oath. It's literally stated that clearly in the text from the Great Wolf. Again, on and on, neither relenting, neither holding back. That is in regards to the fight between the Lion and Leman Russ. Taking all of this together, the context, the feats, and the fight itself, and the conclusion is very straightforward. Base Angron is stronger than base Leman Russ. Not by headcanon, not by guesswork, but by direct textual evidence from their actual duel, so this is a pretty simple conclusion. Next, we have Angron vs Guilliman in the book Betrayer as well. From this fight, we see that Guilliman puts up a pretty decent fight, but Angron completely overwhelms him. Angron and Rebute still fought, with the Lords of the Ultramarines giving ground each time Angron landed a blow. For all of Lokir's disgust, he had to grant a shade of respect to his Genesire. Guilliman had no hope against Angron. Angron plunged his chainsword up under Lord Guilliman's breastplate. A shallow stab, but a telling one. The Ultramarine crushed the impaling sword in one fist and staggered back, truly bleeding now. Sparks sprayed from Rebute's raised gauntlets as he struggled to ward off blow after blow. He was beaten, he was down. Wounds painted him a palette of proud defeat. Even now, his warriors were fighting to retrieve him. Lorgar even notes the severity of Rebute's condition. With the scarring across his armor and the sense of pain bleeding from his mind, Lorgar reckoned his brother would be lucky to ever walk again. Guilliman does manage to wound Angron several times, but Guilliman is the one who ends the fight, kneeling, bleeding, and being dragged away by his sons. Objectively, the text here shows that Guilliman loses. That means that once again, using the context of the duel and the excerpt from the book Betrayer, we find that base Angron is both over base Leman Russ and base Guilliman, which naturally leads us to the next question: who is stronger, Russ or Guilliman? And the best way to figure that out is by looking at shared opponents, and thankfully, both of them fought Magnus the Red. Russ fought a multitasking, slightly nerfed Magnus the Red during the Battle of Prospero in the book A Thousand Suns, while Guilliman faced Demon Primarch Magnus in the book The Gathering Storm. Despite outside factors, Russ defeated Magnus, tanking multiple psychic and physical strikes before finally baning him. Guilliman, by contrast, was overwhelmed by Demon Primarch Magnus and only saved by the intervention of the Sisters of Silence. In addition to this, if you look at the wider 40k lore, Guilliman, even with the Emperor's Blade, has struggled against greater demons like Scarbrand, and has even lost to Corfarion in Know No Fear. Even further, he draws with Lorgar during the book Betrayer, and mind you folks, this is a Lorgar who could not properly use his psychic powers and is not a duelist. We see this clearly in the text. Lorgar repulsed him with a projected burst of telekinesis, weak and wavering with the song still so detuned, but enough to send his brother staggering. The Maul followed, its power field trailing lightning as Lorgar hammered it into the side of Guilliman's head with the force of a cannonball. There was a crack that would have shamed a peal of thunder. And remember folks, Lorgar earlier in this book was able to hurl around tanks and space marines with his psychic powers. Even a psychic nerf, melee mediocre Lorgar could injure Guilliman, which firmly places Leman Russ above Rebute Guilliman, both in their base forms. So after evaluating and comparing these two Primarchs, the rankings would look like this. Base Angron on top, followed by base Leman Russ, and then rounding out the list would be base Guilliman as the weakest of the three so far. Next, we have Sanguinius vs Demon Primarch Angron in the book Echoes of Eternity, one of Warhammer 40k's most cinematic battles. But before we continue, let's discuss what a Demon Primarch is, because that context is very important to ranking both Sanguinius and Demon Primarch Angron. Demon Primarchs are fully fused with warp power, gaining monstrous strength, flight, regeneration, and godlike abilities from their patron Chaos Gods. Angron in particular becomes nearly unkillable, constantly regenerating and growing stronger as blood is spilled around him. Sanguinius defeats Demon Primarch Angron after a brutal battle across the Imperial Palace, culminating in him getting impaled by Angron's Black Blade, which allows him to get closer to him and rip the Butcher's Nails from his brother's brain, and banishing him from the Siege of Terra. Over the course of the fight, Sanguinius wounds Angron repeatedly, survives catastrophic falls, including crashing straight through the dome of a Warmonger Titan, and tanks 5 ground-shattering blows powerful enough to pulp Space Marines, sending both Blood Angels and World Eaters flying. He's consistently faster than Angron in both air and close combat, hurls a spear with enough force to obliterate Angron's jaw, shatter his teeth, sever his tongue, and punch out through the back of his head, fends off intervening World Eaters mid-duel, and even catches a spear moving faster than the human eye can track, breaking the sound barrier as it flies. Despite all of this, the fight turns when Sanguinius begins to tire, because only one of them is immortal, and as his mortal body finally slows, he makes the conscious decision to trade his life for victory, resulting in the outcome we already discussed. So what does this tell us, and how does it help us scale Sanguinius against the other Primarchs? Since I like to break things down in obscene detail, as all of you know, in my cow-sized opinion, this version of Sanguinius, who we'll call Siege of Terra or Echoes of Eternity Sanguinius, differs from his generic or vanilla form, Base Sanguinius. Now, you may be asking yourself, what the hell are you talking about, Cal? This sounds like straight autism to the dome, and I mean, you're not wrong. But hear me out. During the Siege of Terra, Sanguinius does not receive a raw physical amp, but more of an amp to his foresight and precognition. As his destined death at the hands of Horus Lubrical draws closer, his precognition and latent psychic abilities spike dramatically, fundamentally changing how he perceives and fights compared to his base form. Normally, Sanguinius' foresight is vague and unreliable, but in the lead up to his final battle with Horus Lubrical, it becomes sharp and consistent, giving him multiple benefits, such as the future becoming clear, and he's able to merge his consciousness with his other brothers, even perceiving reality through Angron's eyes, turning fragmented nightmares into clear, predictive visions. Regardless of how you want to coin Sanguinius here, he still has a long list of absurd feats. Outside of his fight with Demon Primarch Angron, he has fought throughout the Siege of Terra, participating in probably thousands of engagements across the palace for at least 200 days, and because time itself was breaking down at the end of the siege, it probably was far longer. During this period, he slays Chaos Marines, demons, and even multiple titans like Warhounds and even Warlords, something only possible because of his flight, but still wildly impressive. So, how does Sanguinius scale against the other Primarchs? Sanguinius defeats a vastly stronger version of Angron, who has flight, constant regeneration, amplified strength, absurd durability, and increased power with every kill and skull taken. Now imagine base Angron without regeneration, without warp amp strength, without flight, and without the constant power growth of taking skulls. That version of Angron would get absolutely demolished by Sanguinius. So logically, folks, this places Echoes of Eternity Sanguinius above base Angron, and because base Angron is already stronger than Russ and Gilliman, Echoes of Eternity Sanguinius sits comfortably above all of them. And that leads us to our next fight, which is the Lion vs Demon Primarch Angron in Arc of Omens. And much like Sanguinius, this is a slightly different version of the Lion as well, older, battle-worn, and technically weaker due to age. But the key detail here is that this nerf is so minimal that only the Lion himself even notices it. I am slower than I should be. Curs would have had the flesh off my bones, he murmurs, haunted by his old memories. This may have also been attributed to the fact that he had just woken from stasis in the book Son of the Forest. Regardless of this though, the Lion comes equipped with 2 major upgrades. The Emperor's Shield, a relic so strong that even Demon Primarch Angron can't break it. And this item doesn't just block attacks, it reflects them, turning Angron's strength against him. The Lion also has the ability called Forest Walk, a warp ability allowing the Lion to slip through the Immaterium and appear elsewhere across the galaxy. It's primarily a fast travel ability, not something he can spam mid-combat, but it still speaks to his enhanced connection to the warp. When the lion clashes with Angron, he suffers only a single wound, and only because Angron hurled a goddamn tank at him. Throughout the fight, the lion dodges, outmaneuvers, and outthinks Angron. Eventually, he manipulates Angron into charging straight into his blade, and then finishes the job by crushing his skull and banishing him back into the warp. For a Primarch pushing 10,000 years old, trading blows with a demon Primarch and winning is insanely impressive. So now we would follow the same logic used with Sanguinius. If the lion defeated a far stronger version of base Angron, then he scales above Angron, Russ, and Guilliman. But that brings us to another question. Who is stronger, the lion in 40K or Echoes of Eternity Sanguinius? Both of them beat Demon Primarch Angron, so the only way to compare them is by looking at how they fought him and how well they performed. Now before continuing, I will admit there are other ways to go about doing this. For example, you could look at both characters' feats across the setting and compare those, but for this specific example, since Lionel Johnson in the current setting does not have a ton of feats even though he was reintroduced in 2023, making it an easier choice to just analyze both of their fights against Demon Primarch Angron. Well, first off, when we're looking at Sanguinius, we have to factor in the fact that he is exhausted, wounded, and fresh from a fight against a greater demon named Kabanda. So in that current state, Sanguinius faces down against Demon Primarch Angron. And it is a head-on clash. They fight in the skies, darting around the palace, and Sanguinius is faster and appears to deal a lot more damage to the Demon Primarch, using his foresight and speed to stay out of range of the Demon Primarch, before closing the gap, allowing himself to be impaled, and then ripping the butcher's nails out with his bare hands. The lion, by contrast, dismantles Angron through strategy as opposed to a head-on clash. He uses the shadows and twisting corridors of Wormwood to slip through Angron's attacks, manipulating positioning and forcing mistakes. His style is less about overpowering Angron and more about consistently outthinking him until the killing blow presents itself. Both methods worked, obviously, but they reveal the core difference between the two fights. Sanguinius, even though he is exhausted and wounded, turns the fight into a direct, blazing brawl, while the lion turns it into a tactical hunt. So, who's stronger? If we're talking pure physical power, speed, and combat explosiveness, Sanguinius has the edge, especially in his Echoes of Eternity form, where his precognition is at its peak. And now we come to the last fight, Perturabo vs Angron in the book Slaves to Darkness, which is the most confusing of all these fights so far, which may be the reason I saved it for last. But before we jump into this fight, let's establish some much needed context here. This form of Perturabo that fights Angron is not exactly his base or standard form, as during the book Angels Exterminatus, Fulgrim uses a cursed gemstone to steal Perturabo's life force, allowing Fulgrim to ascend to demonhood. Though the ritual is interrupted and the gemstone shattered, it left Perturabo weakened and actively dying for the rest of the heresy, relying on upgraded, layered armor as a life support system. By Slaves to Darkness, which occurs 6 years after the events of Angels Exterminatus, Perturabo is still significantly weaker and is visibly dying. So, we're gonna call this variation of Perturabo Weakened Perturabo. But the problem with this is we don't know how much of a nerf this weakened state is. We know he is dying, but in the book it states that he upgraded his logo's armor to compensate for this weakness. So it essentially becomes an unquantifiable debuff, a flaw in power scaling that I'm going to discuss later in this video. But enough with the rambling, let's get to the fight, which for the first time in this video is not a true one-on-one duel. Perturabo, the Iron Warriors, and the Iron Circle bombard Demon Primarch Angron from afar. Fist-sized rounds tore into the Demon Primarch. Explosions shattered against brass armor. Missiles and las blasts tore his wings to tatters. His flesh was remaking itself even as it was torn from him. Argonis thought that the creature would fall. Then he seemed to shrink. Wounds closed, armor glowed white and flowed into bullet holes. So right off the bat, we see that the artillery barrage has some effect on Angron as he begins to shrink, showing that he is being weakened by the constant damage he has taken. Even in this weakened state, Angron moves fast enough to fold space and time. Space folded as he moved. His wings were slices of fast-moving shadow. When the two Primarchs finally clash, Perturabo survives Angron's axe, a weapon that slices reality itself. Yes, folks, Perturabo tanks several strikes from Angron that were literally destroying and messing up time itself. Oh my god. The fight continues with Perturabo landing a few counter blows, but for the majority of the fight, Angron is pushing Perturabo further and further back, driving more and more strikes into the Lord of Iron. The turning point comes when he goads Angron into a rage and lands a heavy strike on the Demon Primarch. But Angron retaliates with a strike that rips the helm from Perturabo's head and drives a deep strike down his chest. He lashed a fist at Perturabo, claws toward the front from the Lord of Iron's helm. Organis did not see it done, just the Lord of Iron suddenly still, a crimson trail running down his chest, glowing gashes smiling across his torso. But through all of this, Angron is actively shrinking, which is where the mechanics of Demon Primarch Angron come into play. Angron grows stronger or weaker based on the amount of bloodshed, slaughter, and killing he personally partakes in. Perturabo's entire strategy hinges on denying him this fuel. Because Angron has just taken a massive amount of damage and is not allowed to kill anything or take any skulls, he begins to weaken dramatically as his form puts more energy into reknitting itself as opposed to empowering him further. He seemed to be shrinking, the edges of his shadow and flame bulk retreating, the threads of blood are thinning. The meal of slaughter will only keep you here long enough to see your bastard sons die. This is very different from Angron's fights with the Lion and Sanguinius, where Angron was fighting in the middle of a massive battle, one during the Siege of Terra and the other during Wormwood. In both of those situations, he was heavily empowered, constantly healing, and fully fueled by slaughter. Here, on the other hand, he is badly damaged, isolated, and unable to sustain himself. Then, as Angron begins to weaken even further, Perturabo calls in the Iron Circle and Volk, the first Obliterator, all of whom, especially Volk, unload a torrent of unstoppable firepower, beams of energy, and blizzards of rounds torn to Angron. He was illuminated by a river of gunfire and explosions, flake of ash boiled from his torn flesh. After this, Angron is too weak to continue, and the fight effectively ends. So folks, how do we rank Perturabo based on this absurdly complicated duel with context stuffed to the brim? From this fight, we can draw a clear, practical conclusion. Weakened Perturabo is absurdly durable and tactically brilliant, but he is not a raw physical match for Angron. Even in his unquantifiable nerf state, he absorbs blows that would vaporize lesser beings and survive strikes that the text said would end Titans. The important point here is that Perturabo does not defeat Angron by outmuscling him or outspeeding him, he defeats him by using strategy, baiting Angron, denying him the blood fuel that powers him, timing a perfect counter, and then using heavy artillery and the Iron Circle plus Volk to finish the job. In a straight one-on-one brawl, he never convincingly beats Angron, and he probably never would. He needs planning, leverage, and backup. So in regards to ranking Perturabo in this unknown nerf state, we can easily place him below Sanguinius and the Lion in 40k, because they straight up defeated Demon Primarch Angron without any help in a one-on-one duel. We would also place Perturabo below Demon Primarch Angron and Base Angron. I just simply don't see how he would be able to defeat a fully empowered Demon Primarch without any help or aid, or context for that matter, and the same goes for Base Angron. Why, you may ask? Well, Angron has fought and defeated Guilliman and Leman Russ, so it's reasonable to assume by using logic that Base Angron, who is consistently described as one of the strongest dueling Primarchs throughout the setting, would be able to take on Perturabo, who has no dueling feats outside of his fight with Demon Primarch Angron and is a general and engineer first, as opposed to Angron, who is a gladiator, a duelist, and a warrior. Although it's speculation, I feel like that train of thought makes sense. But it also reveals a flaw with Primarch power scaling and power scaling in general that we're going to get to in a second. So Perturabo sits beneath Echoes of Eternity Sanguinius, Lionel Johnson, or Knight of Nihilus Lionel Johnson. You have to admit, that's a pretty goddamn cool title name. He also sits below Demon Primarch Angron and Base Angron. But after that, things become much more complicated. Gilliman and Russ both lost to Base Angron, the physically weaker, pre-ascended version of Angron. And to the disappointment of every Iron Warriors fan out there, those losses do not automatically mean Perturabo stands above them. To understand why, we need to zoom out and look at each of these Primarchs' feats across the setting, not just a single duel between Perturabo and Demon Primarch Angron. This is where power scaling becomes incredibly difficult and hard as you compare feats across the setting to try to figure out a verdict, and that is exactly what we're going to do. So once again, hold on to your butts, people. From everything I've gathered, Leman Russ should sit above Perturabo when you take his wider showings into account, especially his fights against Magnus the Red and post-Molech Horus. Yes, both of those fights come with context, but even with those factors in play, Leman Russ was still fast and skilled enough to keep up with them, pressure them, and actively wound them. He even managed to bane Magnus the Red, something no one else in the setting can claim. Outside of those encounters, Russ is consistently portrayed as one of the Imperium's greatest duelists. While he couldn't beat Angron in a straight-up fight, his speed, instincts, and versatility would allow him to fare far better against most Primarchs than Perturabo would in a direct fight. And when you factor in Leman Russ's additional feats, the gaps become a lot clearer. Leman Russ could keep up with the Lion in the book The Great Wolf. That's the same Lion who blitzed a Foresight-empowered opponent, Conrad Kurz, in the book Savage Weapons, and Leman Russ was shown to be able to tank hits from Magnus the Red and post-Molech Horus, foes arguably on par with or close to Demon Primarch Angron. Taken all together, Russ comes across as the better duelist, the better fighter, and with durability that sits roughly comparable to Perturabo's. In short, Russ matches most of Perturabo's strengths like durability, but shows that he is far stronger by being the better duelist and being faster, as Perturabo in his duel with Demon Primarch Angron was not fast enough to avoid a strike from the Demon Primarch, while Russ could keep up with the Lion who was able to blitz a precognition foe. Gilliman, on the other hand, is a much trickier comparison. He is durable and relentlessly determined, but he is not consistently portrayed as fast, and in all of his encounters with the Demon Primarchs, he ends up getting overwhelmed. When you compare their feats directly, the contrast is stark. Perturabo takes a strike from an Angron who is literally tearing space and time apart. Meanwhile, Gilliman in his battle with Mortarion lands only a handful of meaningful strikes, even while wielding the Emperor's Sword, a weapon specifically designed to destroy chaos-empowered beings, and still ends up getting folded like a pancake. Because we're looking specifically at weakened Perturabo for this ranking, we also have to acknowledge a major uncertainty. We don't know how severe his nerf truly is. He may have compensated through sheer durability, armor layering, and weapon upgrades. Or he may have been heavily diminished in ways the text never fully quantifies. That unknown makes scaling Perturabo here very difficult. Even so, based on what we do see on page, a weakened Perturabo still demonstrates better durability feats than base Gilliman. Within this framework, the placement makes sense, though it's absolutely debatable and I won't pretend otherwise. The final rankings would look like this. First, Sanguinius during the Siege of Terra. Second, Knight of Nihilus Lionel Johnson in the current setting. Third, Demon Primarch Angron. Fourth, Base Angron. Fifth, Leman Russ. Sixth, weakened Perturabo, and 7th, Rebute Gilliman. Of course, this is all debatable like I just said, and I'm not trying to hyperfixate on the exact order because there's much more to talk about in this video. But this is how you would power scale the Primarchs. To summarize, first, you would look for fights between the two characters you're comparing. If the characters you're looking at have not fought each other, then you would look at common foes or common fights, like we did with Leman Russ and Gilliman. If there are no similar fights between the two characters, then you would look at how well they've performed across the setting, like we did with Perturabo and Gilliman. Through it all, you would take into account context, weapons, nerfs, amps, or anything that would give one character an advantage over the other. Of course, there are a lot of flaws with this system, I will not lie. So now we're going to dive into the flaws, issues, and the limitations of power scaling, and why it is so infamous in the 40K community. So like I've said throughout this video, power scaling in 40K is notoriously tricky, and there are several major issues that make it very frustrating, even for the most hardcore lore enthusiasts like your favorite foe and gal. First is inconsistent writing across multiple authors. One of the biggest problems is that different authors handle the same Primarchs in wildly different ways. For example, Magnus the Red atomizes Vulcan and physically alters his body multiple times in one story, Echoes of Eternity, but then in every subsequent encounter, he never demonstrates anything remotely close to that level of power ever again. The writers seemingly forgot how ridiculously strong Magnus is. And in fact, they forgot how strong every Psyker is. Another example occurs in the book The Lion, when the lion empowers his blade with psychic energy to kill the greater demon Karos Fateweaver. But throughout 40K and 30K, he never uses this warp ability again, despite it being a potentially massive advantage in combat. This inconsistency is rampant throughout 40K, and it makes it very hard to accurately measure a Primarch's powers, abilities, and feats across the board. Second, inconsistent damage tolerance. The damage Primarchs can take is just all over the place. Sometimes they're threatened by bolter fire, other times they tank las cannon equivalent strikes, their armor completely hold, yet their flesh underneath remains untouched. It's maddening, to be honest. This isn't limited to the Primarchs either, guys. It affects the broader 40K universe. Anyone remember Calgar during the Matt Ward era? Yeah, he takes down a Swarm Lord, an Avatar Arcane, a Greater Demon, multiple Demon Princes. The feats he has literally put him on Primarch level, and you can't even debate that because Gilliman has struggled to take down a Greater Demon Scarbrand, while Calgar has made a Greater Demon look like lunch money. Third, a subjective interpretation of abilities. Many feats are open to interpretation. For instance, when a Primarch blocks a blow, one reader might see it as a minor control deflection, while another might interpret it as effortlessly shrugging off a city-level attack. These subjective readings make comparing feats incredibly difficult, because what one author or fan treats as peak power could be minor in another reader's eyes. Fourth, context and situational power. Context is critical when evaluating Primarch duels. You have to consider injuries sustained before a fight, environmental factors like terrain, weather, or battle chaos. Third, psychological state or rage-fueled power boosts. And fourth, whether the Primarch has access to warp energy, relics, or other enhancements. A Primarch's performance can swing wildly depending on these situational variables. You can't just look at the raw output. They're as much as narrative tools as they are combatants. Fifth is how the Primarchs are written in general. Some Primarchs, like the Demon Primarchs, are just simply written like shit. Often, they are shown as immortal, godlike, or nearly unstoppable, but are then defeated in ways that feel purely narrative-driven, and this happens a lot. And it usually occurs to make the loyalists look stronger, or to advance the plot by ensuring the bad guys are temporarily vulnerable. This occurs with Angron, Fulgrim, or Magnus, as they are taken down in ways that contradict their established abilities just to give the good guys a win. This makes scaling them based on feats incredibly unreliable because their showings are heavily influenced by narrative convenience rather than consistency. For example, Fulgrim's fight with Rogel Dorn in the book Saturn. On paper, Fulgrim should annihilate Rugaldorn in a one-on-one duel, and Rugaldorn says as much after the duel ends, but in traditional GW writing, Dorn is able to stalemate Fulgrim, and Fulgrim gets bored and leaves the fight before a conclusion can be made. It honestly makes no sense and makes me want to punch a hole through my wall. Another issue is the assumption problem I talked about during the video. At some point, power scaling in 40K becomes assumption based. You can gather feats, compare showings, analyze context, and cross-reference sources all day, but the setting simply does not provide a clean, objective answer. Like what happened in this video with Gilliman and Perturabo, you eventually have to make informed assumptions or speculative calls rather than rely on hard facts. This doesn't mean the analysis is worthless, it just means it's uncertain, not definitive. And finally, we come to the snowball effect. All of these issues, author inconsistencies, variable damage thresholds, subjective interpretations, situational powers, and on and on and on, combine to make power scaling in 40K almost a maddening experience. You end up dissecting every sentence, analyzing every context clue, and still wondering if the next story will completely contradict everything you just concluded. Honestly guys, it's made me lose sleep more than once. So, next time you watch a Power Scaling Peeps video, have some empathy for your favorite fallen cow. And that ends it for the ultimate guide to Power Scaling the Primarchs. I'll probably do guides to power scaling different characters in the future, but I really wanted to tackle the Primarchs first, especially because of that Dropsite Massacre video. Because a lot of people were doubting you can power scale the Primarchs, and as you've seen throughout this video, you definitely can. I hope you enjoyed this autistic dive into Primarch power scaling, but please, as I conclude this video, don't take it too seriously. This is simply my perspective on the Primarchs and how their feats stack up. Power scaling in 40K will always be messy and inconsistent, but that's part of the fun. Shout out my Patreon and YouTube memberships, Ritter S, Impossible Paul, Keydree, Jack Mantel, Musty, Nico149, Omar, Chris, Soap Tastes Okay, and Nathan. Stay milk, fellas, and make sure you're grazing that grass. Happy holidays from your favorite fallen cow. Love you guys, and take care now.